in the top corner over here, there's a little detail in the window which is different from the window on the other side. And that, I'm pointing to it now there, that is a small stained glass window which William had put into the building to make his office just that little bit more special than the rest of it. So if you're walking past or driving past, have a look up and you'll see it's still there, the little stained glass window specially put in for William Morris. Now, he wasn't only a successful newspaper man, but he also found time to write books. And I've spent my life trying to collect together the 6 books which he wrote. And I finally managed, it's taken me ages, but I managed it. The very first book he wrote was called France and the French. I didn't get that copy until 2014. I searched for half a century or more for that. They're very rare. And then his second book, which is even more rare, this is Ireland and the Irish. And there are only 2 copies of that, which I have, because that was only existed in galley form. And that was extraordinary thing. He spent about 2 or 3 weeks traveling around Ireland and wrote a book of over 100,000 words just in that 2 weeks. That's amazing output. He then got more adventurous and he set off with his third book, if I can show it, to Canada and the United States. He took the train to Bristol and then took a boat across and traveled all around Canada and United States and wrote another book about that. He wrote that one in 1875. And then a few years later, in 1881, he produced what I suppose is his best known book, Swindon 50 Years Ago. And of course, that has been reproduced since in modern times. After that, he kind of ran out of steam of it and he started looking at local villages and he did Wanborough. There are only 50 copies of that. And finally, Marston and Stanton, and there are only 25 copies of that. And as far as I know, I'm the only person who has all 6 of his books. They're very precious to me because he meant a great deal to me. His real influence on me, though, was as a naturalist, because he was a very enthusiastic Victorian naturalist. He had a big collection of minerals and fossils, and his collection, along with the collection of Charles Gore, the 2 collections are put together, and they formed the basis of the Swindon Museum, which moved to Apsley House, I believe, in 1930. But it started out down in Regent Circus before that, but it was too big and had to be moved to Apsley House. So his collection of natural history was, it had all gone to museum, and as a child, I didn't see any of that. But when I was very young, I went up into the attic, and in the attic, I found a trunk. And in the trunk, I found a few remnants of his collection, some fossils and some rocks, and his brass microscope. Now, it was William Morris's brass microscope that started my career as a zoologist. I took it downstairs and I got some pond water from the garden and I looked at it and I was absolutely riveted by what I saw in the microscope. And so it was thanks to William that I started to study my biological studies, and also, of course, to become fascinated by the strange shapes of microscopic nature, which later on perhaps had some influence on my paintings. I don't know whether I can just lift up. There is, if I hold it back here, there is that brass microscope. It's one of my treasures, and I've had it ever since. And that was the William Morris's brass microscope, which he had made in Reading, in Berkshire. I still got that. Now, he was also, I mustn't talk too much about him, but finally, I do want to mention that he was the first person locally to oppose animal cruelty. There was a great deal of animal cruelty back in those days, and William was one of the first people to be concerned about animal welfare and to stamp out abuses. He used to write vitriolic attacks on the people who were performing these cruel acts with animals in his newspaper. The worst ones were the badger baiters. They collected badgers and then had packs of dogs set on them, and people would place bets on which dogs would get torn to pieces by the badger or how long it would take to kill it. It was horrific. And this was going on all the time in Swindon in those days. So William Morris decided to stamp it out. And so the badger baiters said, "We're going to kill you." And they threatened to kill him. So William's reaction to this was to go down to the street where they were all living. There's one in a rather rough part of Swindon. There was this one street where all the badger baiters lived. And he walked up and down the middle of the street like John Wayne, and in broad daylight, and said, "Come out and kill me." And of course, as it was broad daylight, they didn't dare, because they'd have been in serious trouble if they had killed him then. And in the end, he won his battle, and I'm happy to say badger baiting was stamped out. So he became known in Swindon as Badger Morris. And that was his nickname, Badger Morris, because he'd stamped out badger baiting. He also attacked the squirearchy, as he called them, the rich young men who were abusing animals. And they took offense, and they collected together as many copies of the newspaper, the Advertiser, as they could find. And they made a bonfire of it in the market square, and they burnt William Morris in effigy. I'm really proud of the fact that my great-grandfather was burnt in effigy when attacking animal abuses. So that was William Morris. Now, his son, Frank, my grandfather, was a rather unpleasant man, I gather. His only claim to fame was that he was one of the first people in the world to be charged for speeding in his motor car. The offense occurred on Drove Hill, and when he was taken to court, his defense was that at the time of the alleged offense, he was overtaken by a horse and cart. Despite this, he was fined £1 shilling. So that was my grandfather. Now, his son, Harry Morris, my father, wanted to be a writer, and he lived with my mother in a house, hillside house in Purtons, just outside Swindon. And first thing I can remember there as a small child was the tapping of a typewriter. It never stopped tapping. He gave me a typewriter when I was very young, and family legend is that I could type before I could write. I've always been able to type faster than the equipment will allow, and it's been an asset of mine all my life. It was there in Purton that I spent the first 5 years of my life in a small village. But then my father couldn't sell his stories. It was the Great Depression, things were very bad. So he and my mother moved to the brow of Victoria Hill at 58 Victoria Road. And it was there that I spent my life from 1933 to 1951. Now, in those days, of course, for a small child, there was no television, no computers, of course, and there's certainly no television, only 2 radio channels, the Home Service and the Light Programme. And that was it. So for me, the escape from daily drudgery was to go to the cinema. The cinema became incredibly important to me. My mother took me to the cinema in 1937, and I saw my first film in 1937, and it was called Dreaming Lips, and it starred Elizabeth Bergner. It's amazing, really, to be able to remember this from 1937, but I remember it vividly because I hated the film, but I loved the cinema. I loved the drama of the lights going down, the screen lighting up. I'd never seen anything like this. There's the poster. Whoops. There's the poster for Dreaming Lips. It was a very successful film today, but I didn't like it at all because in the end she committed suicide. It was a very sad romantic story, but it started with me an absolute addiction to the cinema. And I was lucky because there were 7 cinemas in Swindon in those days. We were very well served. The oldest one was the Rink Cinema, which was up in the old Market Square in the Corn Exchange. Now, in 1910, it was called the Rink Cinema because originally in 1910 there was a roller skating rink there. Roller skating was the new fad. But by 1919, that fad had passed, and it turned in 1990 into the earliest cinema in Swindon. It's very important to me for a particular reason. One day I was up there and I saw the manager putting the new poster in the front of the cinema, and it was a big card, and I couldn't afford canvases. I was already painting and I couldn't afford canvases. I had no money. And I said, what do you do with the old posters when you finish with them? And he said, we throw them away. So I said, oh, could I have them? So he said, yeah, come in, I'll give it. And I carried off a great pile of these posters. And so all my early paintings were done on the backs of posters from the Rink cinema, except for one. I've kept one because I love the film so much. And I will try to show it to you. There it is. It's For Whom the Bell Tolls, the Ingrid Bergman. And I've still got that poster from the Rink cinema because in 1943, when I saw that film, I thought Ingrid Bergman was absolutely magnificent. And I was very lucky because in the 1960s, I was at a dinner when she was present, and she was one of the most glamorous people I've ever seen, apart from being one of the most brilliant actresses. Well, that was the Rink cinema. Down at the bottom of Victoria Hill, there was the Empire Theatre. This had opened in 1898 as the Queen's Theatre, because Queen Victoria was still on the throne. And I suppose when she died, they changed it from Queen's Theatre to the Empire Theatre. And in 1929, it started showing films. They put in a screen. They didn't stop showing theatrical things. They did both. They did theatre and they did film as well. It was a beautiful old building. There it is, the old Empire. Tragically, later on, it was demolished, which was an act of architectural vandalism because it should have been a protected building. It was a beautiful old building. The interior was like a London theatre. It had boxes and it was really beautiful. It also was the place where I experienced the high point of my entire childhood, because it was there that Laurel and Hardy appeared live on stage. And as a schoolboy, my mother took me, I was in the second row of the stall. And when Laurel and Hardy walked onto the stage, according to my mother, I laughed so loud that Oliver Hardy waggled his necktie at me, his tie, and he and Stan Laurel were my absolute idols. I loved their film. I've seen every single one of their films because there was about their comedy a strangely surreal quality. It was strange to see that they were real people. One expected them to be something like Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck. One didn't expect them to be real people. And there they were standing right in front of me. So that was the high point I had at the old Empire Theatre. Even when they were showing films, they still kept the orchestra pit for the occasional pantomimes they did and so on. And I only mention that because one of the musicians in that orchestra pit was the father of Diana Dors, who played in the orchestra there. Just a little way further down, there was the Regent Cinema in Regent Circus, a very posh cinema, cost you 2 shillings and 7pence to go in. That was 2 and 6 for the cinema and a penny for the seat tax that was imposed on cinemas in those days. So that was 2 and 7pence well spent. And then that was in 1929, and also in 1929 they opened the Palace in Gorse Hill, and then in 1931 there was the Palladium in Rodbourne, and also in 1931 the Arcadia Cinema in Regent Street, a small cinema that showed rather unusual films, and then the jewel in the crown of Swindon cinemas, which opened as late as 1937 with an Art Deco building, which was the Savoy, and it was in the back row of the stalls at the Savoy that Diana Dors and I spent a great deal of time and occasionally looked at the screen. The cinemas were very important to me all through that period. And I really, I sort of escaped into a fantasy world, because much of this time, of course, was spent during World War II. I was at boarding school, but in the holiday times, I was home in Swindon, and I was in Swindon all through World War II. And one of the really annoying things was that when the air raid siren went off, you had to leave the cinema. The house lights came up, and you were all ushered home to go to the safety of your homes. But the great irony was that not one of the 7 cinemas ever hit by a bomb, whereas quite a few of the domestic houses were. There were 158 air raid siren alarms during World War II in Swindon, and 104 bombs fell on Swindon. Now, that sounds a lot, but actually we were very lucky, because there we were, an important industrial site. And so the railways there, you'd think we'd have been absolutely flattened by bombs. For some reason we escaped. We just had a few bombs. And we were very lucky to get away with it, because we were also building Spitfires in Swindon. 120 Spitfires were built in Swindon during World War II. The fun for a boy after there'd been bombing was to go and look for bits of shrapnel in the bombed out houses. And one of the pieces of shrapnel I found was a marvelous shape, and I painted some eyes on it, and it's now in a private collection in Belgium. It became one of my surrealist objects. The other thing was that I found an unexploded incendiary bomb, and I took it home and put it in my bedroom, and I painted a figure on it to make it into what I called a bomb god, an idol. It didn't occur to me that if I knocked it off the place where I was standing, that I'd probably burnt to death. It hadn't gone off, presumably it had a soft landing. It was a really stupid thing to do. I don't have a very good photograph of it. All I've got left is that there's my bomb god. That's an incendiary bomb which has not gone off, which was sitting in my bedroom. It disappeared mysteriously. I think somebody with more common sense than me finally managed to get rid of it, and I've lost it. I've never seen it again. So that was Swindon during the war. It's a very strange, I must just tell you, it's a very strange sensation to be bombed. You see, the bombs were dropped in sticks. It wasn't just a single bomb. There'd be a stick of bombs, and you listened you learned how to deal with this. When the Dornier bombers came over, and you could always tell it was a Dornier by the droning sound. It had a special sound, the engines. You knew it was a Dornier. It went whum, whum, whum. You know, oh, there we go, we're in trouble. And then the first bomb would be dropped. Now, what you then did was to listen very carefully. Was the second whoop louder or softer than the first one? If it was louder, the stick of bombs was coming in your direction. If that happened, my mother said, under the kitchen table. I had to get under the kitchen table, because under the kitchen table, there was a big wire cage, which was reinforced and was meant to be able to withstand the weight of the whole house if it had fallen on top of it. So that was the one safe place we had. And I had to sit in that wire cage until the bombing was over. But luckily, it never reached Victoria Hill. It got as far as Drove Road. Several houses in Drove Road were flattened. And Grandwell Road, just at the bottom of Victoria, they had some houses flattened as well. We had quite a few private homes destroyed. But as I say, we were lucky not to have a more savage bombing than we did. I was away at boarding school at Dors School in Wiltshire, and I was only home in holiday time, but in term time I was there. And all around the school, the preparations for D-Day were taking place. There were huge, we were near Salisbury Plain, and there were huge numbers of military vehicles all massing ready for D-Day. And the schoolboy has his priorities, and my mother kept a letter that I wrote her in which I said, I do hope that the invasion will not interfere with the arrangements for half term. You have to get your priorities right. And we we lived in that strange world of huge amount of human violence taking place all around. As a small boy, I really was rather disgusted with grown-ups. Grown-ups wanted to kill one another. You know, to a small boy, this is very odd. Why do they all want to kill one another? And I was being trained in the Air Training Corps, ready to go and get in my Spitfire. Luckily, the war didn't last that long, and I managed to escape it. But in one of my school essays, I described human beings as monkeys with diseased brains, because I decided there was something seriously wrong. And I had to rebel against this. But I had a loving childhood, and I wasn't going to go around smashing windows. I wasn't going to be a destructive rebel. I had to be a constructive rebel. And I rebelled in two ways, which have stayed with me for the rest of my life. I rebelled by turning away from humans to animals, and I became a passionate zoologist studying animals and animal behavior, which continued the rest of my life. I also discovered in a book in the school library, surrealism. I'd always felt that traditional art I wasn't interested in that. I didn't see any point in painting flowers or landscapes when we had color photography. I mean, color photography does it so much better, I thought. So I as a small boy, I wasn't interested in traditional art. But then when I discovered the surrealists in this book, and I read about how they had rebelled against the horrors of World War I and decided to be rebel artists and to produce strange, weird pictures which were taken from the subconscious mind and not relating to the external world at all. They were creating fantasy worlds, strange worlds in their paintings. And this fascinated me. And I started, while I was at school, I started endlessly doing drawing after drawing after drawing of strange shapes and patterns, influenced to some extent by my interest in biology, I suppose, but not directly related. I didn't copy biological shapes, but I used them as the basis for my paintings. And so that was how at school I became involved in art and in science. There were two different processes because if you're involved in art, you are using the hemisphere of your brain that is specialized for imagination and poetry. If you're doing scientific analysis, you use the other hemisphere of your brain, which is specialized in analysis and scientific thinking. And so I was lucky because I used both sides of my brain, and I developed the two different kinds of thought. They were completely different thought processes. In one, I'm experimenting, testing, measuring, calculating, analyzing. That was my zoological work. And then in my artistic work, I was allowing my unconscious mind to freely express itself on the canvases on the paper. And so that was where at boarding school, I started to develop these two sides of my life. And at this point, I went to a party in Swindon with a lot of young people, and Diana Dors was there, and I was very impressed by her and thought she was an extraordinary individual. And she wrote me a letter. It had a marvelous phrase in it. It said, she wrote it out of the blue. She suddenly wrote me a letter. I had not written a letter to her. And she said, I do hope you won't think that I'm being previous. I thought that was a marvelous expression. I didn't think she was being previous. I was very touched that she wrote me a letter. And in it, she said she wanted to teach me to jitterbug. That was the most important thing. Because she had learned to jitterbug by going to GI sessions at American Army camps near Swindon. And God knows what she was doing there. But anyway, she was a very beautiful young teenager, and she was determined to teach me to jitterbug. Well, luckily for me, there was a place where we could do this because my grandmother owned a disused brickworks in the middle of Swindon, and where they dug out the clay, it had filled with water and become a lake. And nobody was allowed there except me. It was my private territory. And this lake was surrounded by wild entanglement of bushes and shrubs, and there were water birds, and there were toads and newts and frogs and fish. My father had filled it with fish to go fishing there. And I had a raft which I floated on the lake with, and I would put my face close to the water because I didn't want to catch the fish. I wanted to watch the fish. I'm a watcher of animals, not a catcher of animals. And I had a marvelous time there. Now, later on, I graduated from a raft to a canoe. And there was a small island in the middle of this lake, covered in grass. And I pitched my tent there and put my gramophone inside with my swing records. And I paddled Diana Dors out onto my little island. And it was there when I put on the records that she taught me to jitterbug. I'm afraid I couldn't do it today, but I'm told that I was reasonably good at it in the time. Now, of course, that derelict brickyard, long gone, it is now called Queen's Park. It's been tidied up in the middle of Swindon and turned into a posh park. There's an aerial photograph of it, and the arrow shows you the small island on which Diana Dors taught me to jitterbug. Important part of my life. This was all happening in 1945. Then in 1946, I painted a picture which is now in the Swindon. You may know the painting. There it is. And that is the painting which is in the Swindon Art Collection now. I was only 18 when I painted that. I must say, looking at it, it's quite assured for an 18-year-old. And I reduced Diana just to long blonde hair and a pair of huge red lips, because she did have very large lips, and she covered them in very thick, bright red lipstick. And if ever you were kissed by Diana Dors, you would end up with a completely red face, which you then had to get off with a handkerchief. And I was always having a problem. How did I get rid of my red handkerchiefs after I'd been out with Diana? It was one of the really difficult problems of my childhood. Then in 1947, she went off to make movies. We were both fanatical about the cinema, and she made a career of it, of course, and she went to London, and in 1947, she appeared in 3 films already. She was lying about her age because she was she had to pretend she was much older to be able to get into the films. I had to go into the army because there was still conscription, so I was called up into the army in 47, and I had to go off to, well, my army career lasted 2 years. The first year was hell, and the second year was heaven. The first year was all, marching and drilling and so on, and then the second year I got a job as a lecturer in fine art at the Chiseldon Army College. Now, the Chiseldon Army College was very close to my home, so I could actually live at home. It's wonderful. I could get into my studio. And I had to give 1 monthly courses, because if you were being demobbed from the army, you had to go and have a monthly rehabilitation course before you got civilian life. You could choose any subject you like. I mean, if you want to do engineering, you go on a month's engineering course. And if you were just wanting a bit of a skive, you came to me and did fine art for a month. And I had all these people who would turn up, and I did 12 one-monthly courses. I had to bluff my way through because I was only a teenager, and I had to lecture on the history of art and run art classes and life classes. And I really had to bluff my way through that. But it was a huge learning curve for me. And it was during this time that a local art collector heard about me and invited me to go and look at his collection. This was Jimmy Bomford. Now, the Bomford collection was huge and very impressive. I made a list. I mean, he had Picasso, Matisse, Corot, Manet, Bacon, Sutherland, Douanier Rousseau, Gauguin, Derain, Cézanne, Masson, Rodin, Degas, Utrillo, Renoir, Klee, Soutine, Modigliani. That was just some of the artists that I saw in his mansion at Aldbourne. It was breathtaking for me. And Jimmy was very generous. He said, well, when you're talking to your students, what do you show them? I said, well, we have, you know, pictures from books. He said, no, no, no. You must show them the originals. They've got to see the texture of the work. And he put 3 paintings in the back of my little car and said, yeah, show them those. And I drove off. And when I got home, I found that what he'd put in the back of my car was a Renoir landscape, a Soutine, and a Paul Klee. On today's prices, they'd be worth over $1 million. And that was Jimmy. He was generous in that way. He trusted me to take them back, which very regretfully I did. And he got back his 3 paintings, but I was able to show them to my students. And certainly looking at the Renoir landscape, you could see the texture was very important. I'm just checking the time. My time is nearly up. But let me just finish by telling a little bit about James Bomford, because he was a remarkable man. I always described him as a Rabelaisian aesthete, a contradiction. In most of the time, he was a serious collector of art and extremely knowledgeable about it. And then on Saturday night, he just let rip, and we had the Saturday night parties at his house, which were, well, for me as a teenager, it was really quite a shock. All kinds of extraordinary things. I'll tell you one, I'll just give you one example. On one of the parties, there was a naked bicycle race through the mansion. And 2 of the naked bicyclists collided in the main hall. And one of the bicycles shot across the hall and hit a shotgun which was leaning up against the wall. The shotgun went through the air in a curve and went right through a Manet painting. It was a portrait of Madame Manet, which now had a large hole in it where Madame Manet's chest should have been. Jimmy was not too worried about this. He said, I've got a really good restorer. And I have to say that when that painting came back restored, you could not see a sign of any damage. Picture restorers, I have enormous respect for. They are geniuses, what they can do with a damaged painting. One of my paintings was accidentally damaged in an art gallery. It was ripped right across. And I thought it was finished, but no, they sent it off to a restorer. And when it came back, I couldn't see the rip. I don't know how they do it. It's a miracle. Jimmy's parties, of course, were exciting for me because I was able to meet all kinds of artists and poets. It was, for me, a great education. Jimmy himself was very generous, I say, and he gave to the Swindon Art Collection, I'm sure you all know this, I think it was 21 paintings altogether, including works by Ben Nicholson, a very beautiful early Ben Nicholson, also Graham Sutherland, Henry Moore, L.S. Lowry, and a whole lot more. And he, I said, that was very kind of you to give. And he said, yeah, well, it was to do with the dew pond. And I said, what do you mean? Oh, no, he didn't want to talk about it, but it was all about a dew pond. So Swindon Art Gallery has the Bomford collection because of a dew pond. Now, don't ask me to explain. Maybe the archives could tell you. It sounds to me as though he was trying to curry favor, possibly to remove a dew pond that was protected, or I don't know. But anyway, it's funny how certain weird things can trigger a major gift. Swindon got all these. He also gave them 2 early Francis Bacon paintings, which whoever was in charge of the gallery at the time didn't like them and put them in a cupboard. When Jimmy discovered that they've been kept in a cupboard, he took them back. He said, well, I'm not having that. If they're not putting them on show, I'll take them back, which is a tragedy for Swindon because they were beautiful Francis Bacon paintings. I often used to, when I went to the gallery with my students, I would take them out of the cupboard to show them these Bacon paintings. One was an early crucifixion and the other was a still life, and they were magnificent. The crucifixion is now in the private collection of Sophia Loren in Italy, and the still life is in the Modern Art Gallery, National Gallery of Modern Art in Edinburgh. So there again, it was Swindon's loss. It was a great pity. If only they hadn't been put in that cupboard. But all the rest of there, and they formed the basis of a collection of modern art, which is so important that I do believe that we should now somehow or other get a magnificent new art gallery for the city of Swindon, because Swindon should become a city. I believe that very strongly. And you don't have to, people say, oh, it hasn't got a cathedral. It's not, there are cities without cathedrals. So Swindon should become a city and have a magnificent art centre in the middle. And if it does, I shall be very happy. Sadly, at 93, I'm not going to be around to see that. As you know, it's a very slow process. It's taking a very long time. I'm sure you'll get there in the end. My own life since then has been devoted to both art and to zoology. And I've been extremely lucky to live this long. I didn't expect to live this long because I've never taken any exercise or health foods or anything like that. I just seem to be able to last. And it's been a great time. My time is up. I'm watching the clock. I'm 3 minutes over my time. I don't know whether Linda has any further questions for me, but that has been my reminiscing about my years in Swindon. And if you haven't all nodded off, I hope you've enjoyed it. And thank you for listening to me.
Oh, yeah, thank you so much, Desmond. That was absolutely fascinating. Would you take any questions? I'm sure there are people who've got questions. I wonder, I don't know whether people could put them in the chat. Can you put a question in the chat if you want to ask a question? Has anyone got a, oh, right, John Walsh put up his hand. Right, John, can you unmute yourself and ask a question, please?
Yes, I believe I'm on mute. Is that correct? Can you hear me?
Now speaking, yes. We can hear you, yes.
Good. Well, I wanted to ask Desmond whether the bookshop in Wood Street that he mentioned was the one which still existed when we arrived in Swindon and was called Victoria Books, I think.
No, Victoria Books was much later. The original bookshop in Wood Street was, it had taken over from a jewellery shop, which was there before. But no, I remember Victoria Books. I used to go there because they occasionally had copies of William Morris's books. I bought one or two of them there. And I think that bookshop is gone. Because I haven't been to Swindon for such a long time. All the things I've been talking about tonight took place over 70 years ago. So you've really been testing my memory. I'm actually, I must admit that I'm astonished that I've remembered so much, because you don't expect to remember all that, but I can even tell you that Diana Dors' telephone number was Swindon 3751. And that my telephone number...
Too late.
Swindon 2773. So, but why on earth should the human brain retain a useless piece of information like Diana Dors' phone number? I don't know. Anyway, no, the Victoria Bookshop was much, much later, but I do remember it.
Thank you.
I can't hear you.
Sorry, I was saying thank you. But as far as memory goes, Desmond, it's not the 1940s that are the problem. It's last week, as far as I'm concerned.
Yes. I think that is the strange thing about the human brain. It's trying to remember where I put my spectacles. And what is the point of a human brain that can remember Swindon 3751 for Diana Dors' phone number when it can't remember where it's put its spectacles?
Now, I've had, Desmond, somebody's asked now, Simon has asked, are you still painting?
Yes, I painted 80 pictures last year. I haven't started yet this year because I'm working on another book. It's the book I'm working on, when it's published, will be my 100th book. So I've got to finish it before I die, or I shall be very upset to only have 99 books in print. Sorry.
So the question was, are you still painting? And the answer.
Oh yeah, yes. I still I had an exhibition in London, another one in Oxford recently, and I still paint. What I do is I divide my year between painting and writing. When I'm exhausted, I've burned out all my words, I then go into my studio, which is next door, and I paint. And then when I'm painted out, I come back here and write another book. So I write a book, paint a collection, go back and forth, and I'm still exhibiting. In the last 8 years, I think I've painted over 1,000 pictures. So I'm still very busy. The only thing I can do now is to paint and to write. My body is giving up the struggle. I'm finding walking more difficult at 93, but luckily my brain is still working. I'd rather have it that way around. So
there are lots and lots of questions coming forward. Have you written your autobiography? So yeah. Basically, what, you know, can we see that anywhere?
Yes. There you are.
Oh, right. Oh, and that's your autobiography, right?
Yeah. But now that is out of print. But my scientific archive has gone to a museum, to a zoology department in Porto, in Portugal, of all places. They are very keen to develop some of my studies. And they are about to produce a new edition of Watching. I think later this year, there'll be a new edition of this. You can get old copies of this on the, online, but there will be a new edition of Watching, which includes a lot of the, I've just told you, what I've been telling you is in the book, but there's a lot more, of course, in the book.
Yes. Well. Yeah. Let me see now. There are loads more questions. Right. William Brown says, we have a picture of Jimmy Bomford in the Home Guard, which we can show. So, William, can you hold it up?
Yes, I know this picture.
Oh, do you? All right.
Yes, he's got his little black beard.
Right. Yeah. I don't know whether William's holding it or not. Anyway, he doesn't seem to be holding it, but never mind.
No, it was hardly any pictures of him. There's a portrait of him somebody's done, and there's that one. He wasn't interested in having his picture taken. It wasn't one of the things that he was excited by. I didn't mention that that collection I told you about, he sold all of that and instead bought Francis Bacon. He bought over 20 or 30, I think, Francis Bacon paintings. He had huge collection of Francis Bacon before Bacon was known. And then he had a row with Francis. I knew Francis back in the 60s, and he could be difficult. And I said to Jimmy, what was your row about? And he said, caviar. I don't know what he meant, but he says caviar. And he then sold, because he had this row with Bacon over caviar, he sold all his bacons just before Bacon became really famous, which was a mistake. And he then moved on to ancient glass and ancient bronzes and antiquities. He made a big collection of antiquities, part of which he gave to the Ashmolean, another part to the Bristol Museum.
Yeah, great.
He should have given some of that to the Swindon Museum, but I'm afraid the Ashmolean got that.
Yeah, that was a shame. Now, do you have a favourite painting? Another question we've been asked.
Do I have a favourite painting? What, of anybody's?
Of anybody, or an animal, or anything?
Oh, well, I do have one painting of mine which is a great favourite because it was painted by my chimpanzee Congo. I had an exhibition of chimpanzee paintings at the RCA in London in 1957. And Congo was an extraordinary animal. He was able to make patterns and to vary the patterns. They were visually controlled. They weren't scribbles. They were visually controlled patterns. He never got to making imagery, but he did get to making interesting abstract patterns which he started to vary, and I've kept most of those are sold now. There's even one hanging in Buckingham Palace because the Duke of Edinburgh was very interested, and he has it hanging on the corridor just outside his bedroom. Many famous people, Picasso had one of the Congo painting, one of the chimpanzee paintings, and when a journalist asked him why he liked it, he bit the journalist. He jumped on him and bit him, which was Picasso's way of saying the ape and I are in the same business. Salvador Dali, on the other hand, when he saw one of Congo's paintings, he said, the hand of the chimpanzee is quasi-human. The hand of Jackson Pollock is totally animal. Congo's work really fascinates me. And then a friend of mine, Richard Dawkins, said, have you heard about elephants painting in Thailand? And I said, no. And he said, well, they are. They're painting pictures of flowers and trees. And I said, well, that's ridiculous. And so I went to Thailand to investigate. And I found that what was happening was that the mahout was standing next to the elephant and was directing its movements by pulling on its ear. If he wanted a line to go one way, he pulled that way or this way or this. And by pulling on the elephant's ear, he could control them. So the paintings done by the elephants were really being done by the mahout. But the fact that the elephant was sensitive enough to hold a brush in its trunk and to copy what the mahout was instructing it to do to make a picture of a flower, I thought that was extraordinary. So although it was a cheat and they weren't really making pictorial imagery, but nevertheless, it was a surprising piece of sensibility on the part of the elephant.
Right, we've endlessly got, I wonder if anybody else wants to actually just unmute and ask a question now, rather than, because I feel like I'm missing out on some people. Does anybody want to just speak up? And then I think we ought to finish. I think, let me just have a look at the chat. All right, so we've also got a question about, have you sold your house in Oxford? So a Rosie Parker question.
Sorry?
Have you sold your house in Oxford?
Very sadly, yes. We lived there for half a century, my wife and I. My son grew up there. But when she died in 2018, we've been together. We met, my wife and I met at one of Jimmy Bomford's parties in 1949. And we were together from 1949 to 2018. It was a long relationship. I was there in this empty house now. It was a big house. And it was just there were too many memories there. So my family are here in Ireland. I'm living in Ireland now, and next door to my son. And my grandchildren are all around me. So I've moved over here to be with my family. And I very sadly sold the house in Oxford, which because of COVID is still empty to this day. It hasn't yet been occupied because of the COVID crisis.
Right, I think we might have one last question from, oh no, two. Sue and Peter have raised a hand. So Sue and Peter, could you unmute and ask your question?
I wondered what particular issues of zoology really interest you right now in this century?
Good question. One of the things that I've always been interested in is body language. You see, I studied animal behavior, and I was fascinated by all the movements and actions that animals made, and I tried to analyze their origins. And when I came to study human behavior, I looked at humans as just another strange animal. I looked at them zoologically, not anthropologically, zoologically. And I started to study the actions and movements and gesticulations of human beings. And I made a complete human ethogram, it's called. That is a list of every known human action. I've just sent it off to my scientific archive in Porto. And it includes a description of every human action obviously nothing to do with instruments or implements, or it's just body language. It's facial expressions, gestures, gesticulations, and postures. And I've analyzed all of those for human beings and given them names because they didn't have names. We have a very few names for animal act. For human actions, we have a name like a shrug or a wink, but not many. And so if somebody does this, I have to have a name for it. So in 1977, I published a book called Man Watching, which introduced the concept of body language. It's now common for people to talk about body language all the time, but when I introduced the subject, it was new. And I pioneered that, and now I'm still working on that because it enables you to tell so much more about the people who lead us, the politicians. I study, I switch off the sound when politicians are talking, and I listen to I watch their behavior. And by watching their facial expressions, their gestures, their postures, their actions, I can learn a great deal about the people who are great leaders. And I'm already missing Mr. Trump because he was a wonderful supplier of strange gestures. And what is so interesting is that I have a feeling that he had read my book because some of his gestures were deliberately calculated to help him. And I was fascinated by the way in which pre-presidential Trump, when he was just a businessman, if you look at his body language there, and then you look at his body language after he became president, you learn a huge amount about his personality from studying his body language. So my current interest is really in communication systems of human beings and using body language as a system of understanding people. But I think your questioner probably had in mind the problems of that my old friend David Attenborough is dealing with at the moment, of the destruction of our planet. The rate of destruction of our planet is really frightening, and I am obviously very concerned about the fate of so many species. When I was in Borneo, I was going through Borneo in a train, and then out of the window I saw great swathes of ancient forest all cut down, and when I looked at it I said, "What are you doing to your beautiful forest?" And they said, "Oh, we're going to be like you in Europe. You cut down all your forests in Europe, didn't you?" I said, "Well, that was centuries ago." And he said, "Yes, but you've turned Europe into a great civilization, and we in Borneo, we're going to cut down." I thought, "Oh Lord, well, we've actually given them an excuse." And the same is happening in the Amazon, where they're cutting down huge amounts of forest. And of course, these forests, the surviving ones, it's true, we destroy the European forests, and it's too late to do anything about that. But the forests that still exist, particularly in the Amazonian region and so on, they are so important to the climate. And if they go, heaven help us, because the climate will suffer terribly. So there are serious conservation problems now that we have to look at to prevent the planet from, I don't want our species to end up as the mold on a rotting planet, which is a phrase I've used, which makes people upset, but it's what we are becoming. It's like, if you think of the Earth as an orange, it's going green. Only in our case, it's not going green, it's going brown. And we are destroying this planet. And luckily, people have started only recently, really, to take this seriously. And in my childhood, nobody took it seriously. Conservation, I attended the very first conservation meeting, which was in the 1960s in London. And that's when the movement began. It didn't begin until the 1960s. Before that, nobody was interested. Conservation didn't exist. And then Peter Scott started it in the 1960s. And since then, there's been more and more attention paid to it. And with any luck, we will prevent too much destruction.
60 years.
Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now, I feel really maybe we ought to say thank you so much, Desmond, and we ought to let you go because you've been talking for a long time, and it's just been so fascinating, so lovely.
I've enjoyed it. It's been great fun, and I only wish I could have talked to all the people individually. I can see some faces, but I just wish that we could be sitting in the same room together. But let's face it, Zoom is doing a lot of good. I wish I had shares in Zoom because they've doubled in value. And it is now, David Attenborough said to me, I'm all zoomed up. He said, I'm zoomed up. I bet he is.
Yeah.
But it is a useful mechanism, and I've enjoyed using it, and I hope I haven't bored you all too much.
Not at all. It's been fantastic, and thank you so much. So,
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So this is where we switch off.
yes, so we switch off and we say thank you so much, Desmond.
It's been a pleasure.
That was absolutely fascinating, and thank you for being our patron of the Friends. And it's great to actually.
I want to see that new gallery. That's my.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
want to see that new art gallery.
Yes, yes, we all.
Do we all? Mm.
Yeah.